When the lights went silent, the arena was alive in a way that felt almost unreal, as if the air itself had learned how to breathe excitement. Thousands of people filled every seat, their voices blending into a single roaring heartbeat that pulsed through the massive hall. The stage lights cut through the darkness like constellations brought down to earth, sweeping slowly over the crowd, reflecting off faces that carried years of admiration, gratitude, and unspoken stories. This was not just an event. For many, it was a once-in-a-lifetime moment. The chance to see Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock together again, sharing a stage not as characters in a film, but as human beings speaking about kindness, resilience, and the quiet strength that holds people together when life tries to tear them apart. Keanu stood slightly to one side of the stage, hands folded loosely, posture calm, almost reserved. He had that familiar presence, gentle, thoughtful, unassuming, like someone who never wanted to take up more space than necessary, even when the spotlight insisted on finding him. Sandra stood near him, warm and expressive, her eyes scanning the audience with genuine curiosity rather than celebrity detachment. She smiled often, but not in the polished way of rehearsed appearances. Her smile came and went naturally, responding to the crowd's energy, as though she were sharing a conversation rather than addressing thousands of strangers. They had come together for a special evening centered on storytelling, real stories of perseverance, of moments when compassion changed the course of a life, of failures that turned into quiet victories. The audience had listened in complete silence as Keanu spoke about loss, humility, and the importance of treating every person with dignity, regardless of status or circumstance. When Sandra spoke, her voice carried warmth and honesty, describing moments of doubt and fear she had faced, and how small acts of kindness from unexpected people had given her the strength to keep going. There was no script that night, no rigid structure. It felt raw, human, and deeply sincere. Near the front of the stage, a young woman stood among a group of fans who had been invited closer as part of a special segment. Her hands trembled slightly, though she tried to hide it by clasping them together. She had waited years for this moment, not just to see them, but to be in the same space, to feel close to the people whose stories and presence had helped her through some of the darkest moments of her life. Her name was Lena, though no one on stage knew that yet. She had traveled a long distance to be there, saving money slowly, patiently, believing that this night would be something she would carry with her forever. As Sandra began responding to a question from the audience, Lena felt a sudden wave of heat rush through her body. The lights seemed brighter than before, the sound louder, the air heavier. At first, she told herself it was just nerves, just excitement. She had been standing for a while and she hadn't eaten much that day. She took a deep breath, then another, trying to steady herself, but the floor beneath her feet felt strangely unstable, as though it were gently tilting. The moment happened quietly at first, unnoticed by most of the crowd. Lena's vision blurred, the edges of the stage melting into light and shadow. She reached out instinctively, fingers brushing the air, searching for something solid to hold on to. Her heart raced, then skipped, then raced again. In the split second before her strength gave out completely, she heard the crowd's applause swell, and then the world went dark. A subtle shift rippled through the front rows as Lena collapsed. A few nearby fans gasped, some stepping back in alarm, others reaching forward without quite knowing what to do. The microphone still echoed Sandra's voice for a heartbeat longer before the change registered on stage. Keanu was the first to notice something was wrong. His eyes, which had been calmly focused on the audience, sharpened with concern as he saw movement near the edge of the stage that didn't belong to applause or excitement. He didn't hesitate. Without a word, he stepped forward, raising a hand slightly toward Sandra, not to interrupt her, but to signal something urgent. Sandra followed his gaze, and the moment she realized what had happened, her expression shifted instantly from warmth to focused concern. The crowd noise faltered as people began to sense that something was wrong, the energy in the room transforming from celebration to collective worry in a matter of seconds. "Please hold on," Sandra said gently into the microphone, her voice calm but firm, carrying authority without panic. "We just need a moment here." Keanu was already kneeling near Lena, careful, respectful, creating space rather than chaos. He didn't touch her immediately. Instead, he spoke softly, his voice low enough that only those close could hear. "You're not alone," he said, though he wasn't sure she could hear him yet. "We're here." Sandra joined him on the floor, lowering herself without concern for the cameras, the lights, or the thousands of eyes watching. In that instant, the idea of celebrity vanished completely. There were no stars on that stage, only two people responding instinctively to another human being in need. Sandra gently asked for water, her tone steady, reassuring the audience without dramatizing the moment. Keanu positioned himself so Lena would have space to breathe, shielding her slightly from the overwhelming brightness of the lights. For a few seconds that felt far longer, the entire arena held its breath. Security and medical staff moved quickly but calmly, guided by Keanu's quiet gestures and Sandra's composed instructions. Lena began to stir, her eyelids fluttering as consciousness slowly returned. Confusion crossed her face first, followed by embarrassment as she realized where she was and how many people were watching. "It's okay," Sandra said softly, crouched beside her, her voice warm and grounding. "You're safe, take your time." Keanu offered a gentle smile, the kind that carried no judgment, only understanding. "There's no rush," he added, "just breathe." Those simple words, spoken without drama, without urgency, did more than any loud reassurance could have. Lena's breathing steadied, her pulse slowed, and she focused on the sound of their voices, anchoring herself to the moment. The crowd, once restless, now stood in respectful silence, many with hands clasped, others with eyes closed, silently hoping she would be okay. When Lena was finally able to sit up with assistance, Sandra stayed beside her, holding her hand briefly, squeezing it with genuine care. "You don't have to be embarrassed," she told her quietly. "These things happen. What matters is that you're okay." Lena's eyes filled with tears, not from fear this time, but from something deeper. Gratitude, relief, and disbelief washed over her all at once. She had come hoping to see her heroes from afar, never imagining that they would kneel beside her, speak to her, treat her with the same care they would offer a close friend. As medical staff helped Lena off stage to rest, Keanu stood and turned back toward the audience. He didn't rush to resume the program. Instead, he addressed the crowd with the same calm sincerity he carried in every word. "Thank you all for your patience," he said. "Moments like this remind us why we're really here for each other." Sandra nodded beside him, her eyes still lingering toward the side of the stage where Lena had been taken. "Let's take a breath together," she added gently. "Kindness isn't something we schedule. It shows up when it's needed most." The applause that followed was different from before. It wasn't loud or explosive. It was steady, heartfelt, filled with respect rather than excitement. People weren't clapping for celebrities anymore. They were acknowledging humanity, empathy, and the quiet power of simply showing up for someone else. Backstage, Lena sat wrapped in a light blanket, sipping water, her hands still trembling slightly. Her heart was calmer now, but her mind raced with what had just happened. A staff member reassured her that she would be fine, that fainting from stress or exhaustion was more common than people realized. Still, Lena couldn't stop replaying the moment in her head. The sound of Sandra's voice, the calm in Keanu's eyes, the way neither of them had treated her like a disruption or an inconvenience. She had felt invisible for much of her life, like someone standing on the edge of the world watching others move forward. But in that moment on that stage, she hadn't been invisible at all. She had been seen, heard, and cared for, not because of who she was, but because she was human. And as the event slowly resumed on stage, something subtle but profound had changed, not just for Lena, but for everyone who witnessed what happened. The stories that would be told that night would no longer be just words. They had already become action, woven into a moment that no one in that arena would ever forget. The quiet weight she carried. When Lena finally opened her eyes fully, the first thing she noticed was the stillness. It was different from the heavy silence she had felt moments before fainting on stage. This quiet felt gentle, protective, like a pause the world had taken just for her. She lay on a narrow couch backstage, a soft blanket pulled up to her shoulders, the hum of distant voices filtering through the walls like waves far from shore. Her head throbbed lightly, not with pain but with exhaustion, as though her body had finally decided it could no longer carry what her heart had been holding for years. A staff member sat nearby, offering a reassuring smile without pressing her with questions. Lena nodded faintly, grateful for the patience. She had spent most of her life learning how to endure silently, how to push through discomfort without asking for help. Even now, part of her wanted to apologize for what had happened, to minimize it, to pretend she had simply tripped or lost her balance. But something about the way Sandra had spoken to her earlier, and the calm steadiness in Keanu's presence, had softened that instinct. For once, Lena allowed herself to just exist in the moment, breathing slowly, letting the weight inside her chest loosen slightly. As she rested there, memories drifted in uninvited, as they often did when her defenses were down. Lena had grown up in a small town where dreams were spoken about quietly, if at all. Her family worked hard, always just a step away from falling behind, and from a young age she had learned that survival came before aspiration. She loved stories, films, and music, not because they promised fame or escape, but because they showed people surviving heartbreak, loss, and fear with grace. Watching Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock on screen had been more than entertainment for her. Their characters, and later their real-life interviews, had become reminders that gentleness and strength could coexist. Life, however, had not been kind in the way stories often are. Lena had faced setbacks that piled up slowly, quietly, until they felt normal. A job she loved disappeared overnight when the company downsized. A close relationship faded not because of anger, but because both people were too tired to keep fighting the distance between them. Financial stress became a constant background noise, and the pressure to appear fine grew heavier with every passing year. Through it all, Lena learned to smile convincingly, to reassure others that she was managing, even when she felt like she was barely holding herself together. The night of the event had been meant as a gift to herself, a rare act of self-kindness. She had almost canceled at the last minute, telling herself it was irresponsible to spend money on something so fleeting. But something inside her had insisted that she needed it, not the spectacle, but the reminder that hope still existed somewhere beyond her daily routine. Standing near the stage, listening to Keanu and Sandra speak with such honesty about vulnerability and compassion, she had felt emotions rise that she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. The fainting hadn't been just physical exhaustion. It had been the release of years of unspoken weight. A gentle knock interrupted her thoughts, and to her surprise, Keanu stepped quietly into the room, accompanied by a staff member who lingered near the door. He didn't approach immediately, giving Lena space, as if instinctively understanding how overwhelming his presence alone could be. "Hi," he said softly, his voice the same calm tone she remembered from earlier. "I just wanted to check in and see how you're doing." Lena's heart raced again, this time not from fear but disbelief. She sat up a little straighter, suddenly aware of how small the room felt. "I'm okay," she said quickly, the familiar urge to reassure taking over. "I'm really sorry about what happened. I didn't mean to interrupt." Keanu gently shook his head, cutting her off without a hint of impatience. "You didn't interrupt anything," he said. "You're more important than a schedule." The words were simple, but they landed with unexpected force. Lena swallowed hard, her eyes stinging as she nodded, unable to trust her voice for a moment. Sandra appeared a few seconds later, slipping into the room with the same quiet grace, a warm smile immediately softening Lena's tension. She sat on a chair nearby rather than standing over her, lowering herself to Lena's level. "We just wanted to make sure you're truly okay," Sandra said, "not just physically." That question, so gentle, so sincere, was something Lena hadn't heard directed at her in a long time. She hesitated, then shrugged lightly, as if trying to keep her emotions contained. "I think I just pushed myself too hard," she said. It was a partial truth, and they seemed to understand that without needing her to explain further. Keanu nodded slowly. "A lot of people do," he replied, "especially the ones who care the most." He didn't ask for details. He didn't pry. He simply acknowledged something Lena had felt but never named. The room felt safer somehow, as if judgment had been quietly removed from the equation. Sandra leaned forward slightly, her voice low and reassuring. "You know," she said, "strength isn't about never falling. It's about letting yourself be human when you do." Lena felt tears finally spill over, not in dramatic sobs, but in quiet, unstoppable streams. She covered her face instinctively, embarrassed by the vulnerability, but neither of them reacted with discomfort. They waited, patient, present, allowing her to feel without rushing her toward composure. When Lena finally looked up, wiping her eyes, Sandra handed her a tissue with a soft smile. "Thank you for being here tonight," she said. "Your presence mattered more than you know." Lena laughed weakly through her tears, shaking her head in disbelief. She had come feeling insignificant, and now she was being told, by people she admired deeply, that she mattered. Out in the auditorium, the event continued, but the energy had shifted. The audience listened differently now, more intently, as if the earlier moment had reminded everyone of their shared fragility. Keanu and Sandra spoke less about themselves and more about the unseen battles people carry, about the importance of paying attention to one another, even when it's inconvenient. Their words felt grounded, not inspirational in a distant, unattainable way, but practical, lived-in, real. Backstage, Lena was eventually told she could leave once she felt steady enough, though she was welcome to stay and rest as long as she needed. As she prepared to go, Sandra stood and gave her a brief, heartfelt hug, one that felt more like reassurance than consolation. "Take care of yourself," she said softly. "And don't forget, you're allowed to rest." Those words echoed in Lena's mind as she stepped out into the cool night air later, the city lights blurring slightly as tears welled up again. She felt different, not suddenly healed or transformed, but lighter somehow, as if a door she hadn't known existed had cracked open. The night that had begun as a personal escape had turned into something far more meaningful, a reminder that compassion can appear when you least expect it, and that even in a room full of strangers, you are never truly alone. And though Lena didn't yet realize it, that single moment on stage would ripple outward, quietly reshaping not only her own path, but the way countless others would see kindness, empathy, and the power of simply stopping to care. The aftereffect no one saw. The days that followed the event passed quietly on the surface, but beneath that calm, something inside Lena had shifted in a way she could not easily explain. She returned to her small apartment, resumed her routines, and answered messages from concerned acquaintances who had heard fragments of what happened through social media posts and second-hand retellings. She assured everyone she was fine, that it had just been exhaustion, that there was no need to worry. Yet every time she closed her eyes, she found herself back in that moment on the stage, not when she fainted, but when she woke to calm voices, steady hands nearby, and a kind of attention that felt deeply human rather than performative. That memory lingered not as something overwhelming, but as a quiet presence that refused to fade. For years, Lena had lived as if her needs were negotiable, something to be postponed until everything else was taken care of. She had grown used to the idea that strength meant endurance, that showing vulnerability was a luxury she could not afford. But now, something subtle challenged that belief. The way Keanu had spoken to her without urgency, without pity, and the way Sandra had looked at her not as a problem to be solved, but as a person worth listening to, had planted a question Lena had never allowed herself to ask before. What if taking care of herself wasn't weakness, but responsibility? She noticed changes in small, almost invisible ways. She began eating regular meals instead of skipping them when stress took over. She went to bed earlier instead of staying awake replaying worries that never led to solutions. On her walks to work, she allowed herself to pause, to notice the way sunlight filtered through trees or how strangers exchanged brief, wordless moments of understanding. None of these things felt dramatic, yet together they formed a shift in how she moved through the world, as though she were finally giving herself permission to exist rather than merely endure. Unbeknownst to Lena, the moment on stage had also left a lasting impression on others, particularly Keanu and Sandra. Long after the event ended and the audience dispersed, the image of Lena collapsing and the silence that followed stayed with them. It wasn't because it had been frightening or disruptive, but because it had been honest. In a space designed for inspiration, reality had stepped forward uninvited, reminding them both why they had chosen to use their voices the way they did. Keanu found himself thinking about Lena during quiet moments, like when he sat alone between meetings or stared out the window of a car stuck in traffic. He had seen countless crowds over the years, but something about that night stood out. It wasn't heroism or drama that mattered to him. It was the reminder that everyone carries unseen weight, and that sometimes the most meaningful thing a person can do is simply stop and acknowledge another's humanity. The world often rewarded speed, efficiency, and performance, but that moment had rewarded stillness. Sandra felt it too, though she expressed it differently. She spoke about the incident during a private conversation with a close friend, not as an anecdote, but as a reflection. "It reminded me," she said quietly, "that we don't really know the impact of our words until someone needs them." She realized that night had not been about being admired or applauded. It had been about presence, about responding without hesitation when empathy was required. It reinforced something she had always believed, but sometimes struggled to practice amid the demands of public life. Meanwhile, Lena returned to work, where her job felt the same on the surface but subtly different in how she experienced it. She noticed colleagues who seemed exhausted, overwhelmed, or unusually quiet, and instead of brushing past them as she once might have, she paused. She asked how they were doing, not as a polite formality, but with genuine interest. At first, the responses were brief and guarded, but over time, people began to open up, sharing frustrations, fears, and small victories. Lena listened without trying to fix anything, mirroring the patience she had been shown backstage. One afternoon, a coworker confided in her about feeling invisible and burned out, words that echoed Lena's own past thoughts. Without thinking, Lena repeated something Sandra had said to her almost word for word, telling her colleague that strength wasn't about never falling, but about allowing yourself to be human. The coworker's eyes filled with tears, and in that moment, Lena understood something profound. Compassion didn't end when the lights went out. It traveled quietly from one person to another, changing lives in ways that might never make headlines. The story of the fainting fan circulated online, as such moments often do, but Lena avoided reading most of it. She wasn't interested in how strangers interpreted what happened or in the exaggerated narratives that sometimes emerged. What mattered to her wasn't the version of the story that others consumed, but the one she lived with daily. Still, she couldn't entirely escape its reach. Occasionally, she received messages from people she didn't know, sharing their own experiences of burnout, anxiety, or feeling overwhelmed, and thanking her for unintentionally reminding them that it was okay to pause and ask for help. These messages humbled her. She had never set out to be seen or heard in that way, and the attention made her uncomfortable at times. But she began to understand that vulnerability, when met with kindness, could create a bridge between people rather than a wall. Her fainting hadn't been a failure. It had been a moment of truth, one that allowed others to reflect on their own limits. Keanu and Sandra, too, carried the experience forward into their work. In subsequent appearances, they spoke less about abstract ideas of success and more about care, rest, and attention. They didn't reference Lena directly, respecting her privacy, but the influence of that night was unmistakable in the way they framed their stories. Their words resonated differently now, grounded in lived experience rather than theory, and audiences responded with a depth of connection that surprised even them. For Lena, the most significant change came quietly one evening when she found herself sitting alone, reflecting on how far she had come without realizing it. She thought about the version of herself who had stood near the stage, holding her breath, afraid of taking up space. That version felt distant now, not gone, but understood. She didn't feel cured or transformed into someone fearless, but she felt something far more valuable, permission to be imperfect. As she prepared for bed that night, Lena wrote a short note to herself, something she had never done before. It wasn't a grand declaration or a list of goals, just a simple reminder written in careful handwriting. Rest is not weakness. Asking for help is not failure. Being seen is not something to fear. She placed the note by her bedside, unsure why she felt compelled to do so, but trusting the instinct nonetheless. The ripple that began on a brightly lit stage had traveled far beyond that moment, weaving itself into lives in ways no one could have predicted. And as Lena drifted into sleep, calmer than she had been in years, it became clear that what happened that night was not an ending, but the beginning of a quieter, deeper transformation. One built not on applause, but on understanding, empathy, and the courage to pause when the world expects you to push forward. When kindness comes back around, time has a way of moving forward even when something inside you is still catching up. And for Lena, the weeks after the event unfolded with that exact tension. On the outside, life appeared steady, even ordinary. She went to work, paid her bills, answered messages, and smiled when required. Yet internally, she felt as though she were standing at the edge of a new understanding, one she had never been taught how to step into. The compassion she had received on that stage had not faded. Instead, it lingered like a quiet echo, surfacing in moments when she least expected it. It challenged her habits, her assumptions, and the deeply ingrained belief that she had to face everything alone. One afternoon, Lena received an unexpected email from an address she didn't recognize at first. It was brief, respectful, and written with care, explaining that it came from a member of the event's organizing team. They wanted to check in not for publicity or follow-up appearances, but simply to ask how she was doing and whether she had safely recovered. Reading it, Lena felt a lump rise in her throat. She had grown accustomed to moments being transactional, kindness often tied to obligation. This wasn't that. This was continuity, proof that the concern shown that night hadn't ended when the audience left their seats. She replied honestly, thanking them and assuring them she was doing better. Writing those words felt strange, almost like a confession. For years, Lena had been quick to say she was fine without reflection, but now she paused before typing, considering what she actually felt. Better didn't mean perfect. It meant she was listening to herself in a way she hadn't before. It meant she was learning to notice when she was overwhelmed rather than pushing through until her body forced her to stop. Around the same time, changes began unfolding quietly at her workplace. The atmosphere had always been fast-paced, efficiency valued above all else, but something subtle shifted in how people interacted. Lena wasn't the only one who had been carrying invisible strain. Conversations that once stayed on the surface grew more honest, as if her openness had given others permission to loosen their guard. She found herself becoming a steady presence for those around her, not because she had answers, but because she had learned the power of listening without judgment. One evening, after a particularly long day, Lena stayed late to help a colleague who was struggling to meet a deadline. They worked in silence at first, then gradually began to talk, sharing frustrations and fears neither had voiced before. As they packed up to leave, the colleague thanked her not just for the help, but for the way she made the space feel safe. Walking home that night, Lena realized that the kindness shown to her had begun to move outward, shaping her actions without conscious effort. It wasn't something she performed, it was something she embodied. Elsewhere, the moment continued to resonate in quieter corners of Keanu's and Sandra's lives as well. For Keanu, the experience reinforced a commitment he had long held but now felt renewed. He became more deliberate about slowing down during public appearances, taking time to acknowledge individuals rather than crowds, and allowing silence where it felt necessary. In conversations with colleagues, he spoke openly about the importance of recognizing burnout before it demanded attention in more painful ways. It wasn't a campaign or a message he promoted loudly. It was a shift in presence, one that those around him noticed and responded to. Sandra, too, carried the memory forward, especially during moments when she felt stretched thin by expectations. She found herself thinking back to Lena's face when she had woken backstage, the mixture of embarrassment and relief, and how quickly that vulnerability had softened into trust. It reminded Sandra that authenticity, even in its most fragile form, could create connection far deeper than any polished performance. In interviews, she spoke gently about listening to your body, about honoring limits, and about how compassion begins with paying attention, not with grand gestures. Back in her own life, Lena faced a decision she had been postponing for months. An opportunity had arisen to apply for a role she had always assumed was beyond her reach, something that aligned more closely with her passions but carried uncertainty and risk. In the past, she would have dismissed it immediately, telling herself it was impractical or irresponsible. This time, she allowed herself to consider it seriously. The voice in her head that once whispered doubt was still there, but it was quieter now, balanced by another voice reminding her that she deserved growth, not just survival. She spent evenings researching, reflecting, and preparing her application slowly, carefully, without the frantic pressure she once imposed on herself. Whether or not she succeeded felt less important than the fact that she was trying. The act itself felt like a declaration, not to the world, but to herself, that she was allowed to pursue something meaningful even if it scared her. The memory of that night remained a source of strength during moments of uncertainty. Lena didn't romanticize it or turn it into a symbol of rescue. Instead, she saw it for what it was, a moment when people chose presence over progress, humanity over agenda. It reminded her that help could appear in unexpected forms and that receiving it didn't diminish her worth. If anything, it affirmed it. As weeks turned into months, the intensity of the experience softened, but its impact endured. Lena noticed that when challenges arose, she no longer immediately blamed herself or pushed her needs aside. She paused, assessed, and reached out when necessary. Sometimes that meant talking to a friend. Sometimes it meant saying no. Sometimes it meant resting without guilt. Each choice, small on its own, contributed to a larger shift in how she related to herself and others. The kindness shown on that stage had not fixed everything, nor had it promised an easy path forward. What it had done was far more powerful. It had interrupted a cycle of silent endurance and replaced it with awareness. It had reminded Lena, and those who witnessed or felt its ripple, that empathy does not need an audience, and that the most meaningful moments often arrive unplanned, asking only that we pay attention. And as life continued to unfold, steady and unpredictable all at once, it became clear that the story was still being written. What began as a moment of collapse had transformed into a foundation for growth, connection, and quiet courage. The lights may have dimmed that night, but something far more lasting had been illuminated, an understanding that kindness, once given, rarely stops with a single act. The moment that came full circle. By the time spring arrived, Lena could no longer pretend that her life was simply continuing as before. The changes were not dramatic enough to be noticed by strangers, but they were unmistakable to her. She felt more present in her own days, more aware of the quiet signals her body and mind sent when something was off. Where she once ignored exhaustion until it overwhelmed her, she now paused. Where she once dismissed her own feelings as inconveniences, she listened. It wasn't that her problems had disappeared. It was that she had stopped treating herself as one of them. The application she had worked on so carefully sat submitted now, no longer something she could revise or second-guess. Letting go of it had been harder than she expected, not because she feared rejection, but because the process had represented a version of herself she was still getting used to, someone who believed her aspirations deserved space. In the weeks that followed, Lena tried to focus on what she could control, grounding herself in routines that felt nurturing rather than draining. She walked more, slept better, and allowed herself moments of stillness without guilt. One afternoon, while she was sorting through emails at work, a message appeared that made her heart race in a way that felt different from anxiety. The subject line referenced the role she had applied for, and for a moment she couldn't bring herself to open it. She stared at the screen, taking slow breaths, reminding herself that whatever the outcome, the act of trying had already mattered. When she finally clicked, the words blurred slightly as she read that she had been invited to the next stage of consideration. It wasn't an offer yet, but it was validation that her voice and experience were being taken seriously. That evening, Lena sat alone in her apartment, the city sounds drifting in through an open window, and allowed herself to feel proud. Not in a loud or triumphant way, but quietly, steadily, like acknowledging a truth she had long denied. She thought back to the version of herself who had stood near the stage months earlier, overwhelmed by emotion and convinced she didn't belong anywhere that visible. The contrast was striking. She hadn't become someone else. She had simply stopped hiding from herself. Around the same time, Keanu and Sandra crossed paths again during a small, private gathering unrelated to work. Their conversation drifted naturally to the event, as it still did from time to time. Neither of them spoke about it with drama or self-importance, but there was a shared understanding of its significance. "It stayed with me," Sandra admitted quietly. "Not because of what we did, but because of what it reminded me to notice." Keanu nodded in agreement. "It showed me how easily we can miss what's right in front of us when we're rushing," he said, "and how much it matters when we don't." There was no sense of closure in their words, only continuity, a recognition that moments like that weren't meant to be wrapped up neatly, but carried forward in how they chose to show up afterward. For Lena, that continuity became tangible in an unexpected way. One evening, she received a handwritten note in the mail, something so rare it made her pause before opening it. The return address was unfamiliar, but inside was a brief message from the event organizers, expressing gratitude for her openness and courage and wishing her well. Tucked inside was a small card bearing a simple message about compassion and rest. There was no signature from Keanu or Sandra, no grand gesture, just a thoughtful acknowledgement that felt deeply personal. She placed the card beside the note she had written to herself weeks earlier, recognizing how both carried the same theme, the importance of care, given and received. The realization struck her that kindness often comes full circle, not always in the way you expect, but in ways that reinforce its meaning. What had begun as an unplanned moment of vulnerability had grown into a chain of quiet affirmations, each one strengthening the next. As Lena prepared for the next interview stage, nerves returned, but they were accompanied by something new: trust. Not the certainty of success, but trust in her ability to handle whatever came. She reminded herself that even if this opportunity didn't work out, she had already proven something essential, that she could step forward without abandoning herself in the process. On the day of the interview, Lena walked into the building with a steady pace, her shoulders relaxed, her breath even. She answered questions thoughtfully, drawing from her experiences honestly rather than trying to impress. When she spoke about resilience and empathy, her words carried weight because they were lived, not rehearsed. She left the building feeling grounded, knowing she had shown up fully, regardless of the outcome. Later that night, she reflected on how a single moment of collapse had revealed a deeper strength she never knew she possessed. It hadn't been discovered through achievement or recognition, but through being cared for when she felt most exposed. That experience had taught her that strength isn't built by standing alone, but by allowing connection to shape you. As spring deepened, bringing longer days and warmer light, Lena felt something settle into place. Life still demanded effort, patience, and resilience, but it no longer felt like a solitary burden. The compassion she had received had become part of her internal language, guiding her choices and softening her self-judgment. And while she knew challenges would continue to arise, she also knew she no longer had to meet them with silent endurance. The moment on stage had not been an interruption in her life's story. It had been a turning point, one that reminded her of her own worth and the quiet power of human connection. And as she looked ahead, Uncertain but hopeful, Lena understood that kindness, once truly felt, becomes something you carry with you, shaping not just how you are treated, but how you choose to live. What remained after the applause? The email arrived on an ordinary morning, the kind that usually passed without consequence, and for a moment Lena almost missed it. Her phone vibrated softly on the kitchen counter as she poured herself a cup of tea, the steam rising slowly, curling into the quiet air of her apartment. She glanced at the screen, expecting nothing more than routine notifications, but when she saw the sender's name, she froze. Her hands tightened slightly around the mug as she set it down, suddenly aware of her heartbeat, steady but deliberate, as if it already sensed the weight of what was coming. She didn't open the message right away. Instead, she sat at the small table by the window, looking out at the city waking up, reminding herself to breathe. This was something she had learned in the months since the night on stage, how to stay present instead of bracing for impact. When she finally opened the email, she read it slowly, carefully, letting each sentence settle before moving to the next. She had been offered the role. The words didn't explode with fireworks in her mind. There was no rush of disbelief or overwhelming joy. What she felt instead was a deep, grounding calm, followed by emotion that rose gradually, like a tide rather than a wave. Lena closed her eyes, resting her forehead briefly against her hand, and allowed herself to feel it fully. This moment wasn't just about a new opportunity. It was proof that something fundamental had changed, not in the world around her, but in the way she had shown up for herself. As the day unfolded, she moved through it differently than she once would have. She shared the news with a few close people, receiving congratulations that felt warm and genuine, but she didn't rush to celebrate outwardly. The victory felt personal, internal, rooted in the journey rather than the destination. She thought back to that night, to the lights, the silence, the moment when her body had forced her to stop because her mind and heart no longer could. What once felt like collapse now revealed itself as a turning point that had quietly redirected her life. Elsewhere, Keanu and Sandra continued forward with their own lives, busy and full as ever, yet the memory of that night never truly left them. It didn't surface as something they revisited often or spoke about publicly, but it lived in the way they moved through the world. Keanu found himself more intentional in moments of pause, more willing to stop when something didn't feel right, even if it disrupted plans or expectations. He carried the understanding that being present for one person could matter more than fulfilling any agenda. Sandra felt it in subtler ways, particularly in how she listened. She noticed herself leaning in more during conversations, allowing silence instead of rushing to fill it, trusting that presence alone could be enough. She often thought about how quickly Lena's embarrassment had dissolved into relief when she realized she wasn't being judged. That awareness stayed with her, reminding her that compassion doesn't require solutions, only attention and care. For Lena, the weeks leading up to her transition into the new role were filled with preparation, reflection, and a sense of closure she hadn't expected. On her last day at her old job, she took a moment alone before leaving the building, standing still in the hallway where she had once walked with her head down, pushing herself past exhaustion. She felt gratitude, not because it had been easy, but because it had shaped her resilience and led her to understand her limits. She left quietly, carrying no resentment, only respect for how far she had come. On her first day in the new role, Lena arrived early, not out of anxiety but anticipation. She took in the unfamiliar environment with curiosity rather than fear, reminding herself that growth often feels like standing on uncertain ground. As she settled into her work, she noticed something else. The empathy she had learned to practice didn't fade under pressure. Instead, it became one of her greatest strengths. She approached challenges thoughtfully, collaborated openly, and offered patience where she once might have withdrawn. Months later, Lena attended another public event, smaller and less dramatic than the one that had changed her life, but meaningful in its own way. As she sat among the audience, listening to speakers share stories of resilience and hope, she realized how different this experience felt. She wasn't there to escape or to be rescued by inspiration. She was there as someone who had lived through her own quiet transformation, grounded in the knowledge that strength and vulnerability were not opposites, but partners. She thought again of Keanu and Sandra, not as distant figures, but as people who had responded instinctively to a moment that demanded humanity. She didn't feel the need to reach out or be acknowledged again. The gift they had given her didn't require ongoing connection or recognition. It lived on in how she treated herself and others, in the way she paused when someone seemed overwhelmed, and in her willingness to admit when she needed rest. As time passed, the story of the fainting fan became just that, a story. It faded from headlines, replaced by newer moments, newer narratives. But its true impact was never meant to be permanent in the public eye. It was meant to live quietly, invisibly in the lives it touched. For Lena, it became a reminder that moments of vulnerability can open doors we never knew existed, and that being cared for can teach us how to care for ourselves. One evening, long after the event had faded into memory for most, Lena returned home after a full day, tired but fulfilled. She set her bag down, turned on a small lamp, and noticed the note still resting by her bedside, the one she had written months earlier. She smiled softly, recognizing how its words no longer felt aspirational but true. Rest was no longer weakness. Asking for help was no longer failure. Being seen was no longer something to fear. The night that had once gone silent under bright stage lights had taught her something lasting. That kindness does not need perfection, timing, or an audience. It only needs presence. And long after the applause ended, that presence continued to shape lives, quietly and profoundly, proving that the resilience of the human spirit is often revealed not in moments of triumph, but in the simple act of showing up for one another.